question. And one of my other main criticisms, I suppose, very sadly, is that when we look at Muslim civil society, we generally only look at it in the context of conflict. We don't really see it in the context of, post-colonial development, post-imperialist, the post-imperialist imperative, etc.
My concern was with Iraqi NGOs, and one of the benefits, one of the dividends of liberation was the enormous mushrooming and the creation and the proliferation of Iraqi NGOs throughout the country. We estimate that there may be as many as 1,000 NGOs today in Iraq. Now, I should qualify this and say that we cannot think of them in sort of Western terms. These are not organizations with established rules. They're not institutionalized. Many of them are groups of people who coalesce around certain interests, but they really are still very embryonic, and very few of them have acquired a kind of strength and sustainability that one thinks associates with the NGOs. One of the problems that we have had in Iraq is that, you see, I come from a background where I regard civil society and civil society institutions as a full 50% of the equation of democracy, the other 50% being government. If you don't have the civil society institutions and a strong, vocal civil society, then you really don't have a democracy. When the CPA came to Iraq, they completely neglected this 50% of the equation. In my view, they focused to such a great extent on infrastructure development, infrastructure repair, and setting up ministries and so on, all the sort of top-down systems, that they really lost sight of the need to also create institutions from the bottom up. They had some rather feeble and faint-hearted programs to help to do civic education, to help NGOs, but the programs they certainly have not achieved anything that I think is of value. As a consequence, the NGOs that do exist in Iraq today have had no organizational training, they have had no developmental training, they have had no content training, in other words, training in the specific issues that they wish to address. They have no training in advocacy, and they have no funding. The funding situation vis-a-vis Iraqi NGOs has been absolutely appalling, because although USAID allegedly had set aside some funds to give to local NGOs, but through the bureaucracy and through the top-heavy administration of these grants, in the end, very little actually percolates down to the NGOs themselves.
First, the importance of NGOs as a recipient of funders' aid is a relatively recent phenomenon. When I began working on development and social justice issues roughly 50 years ago, the state was seen as the dominant motor of development, and certainly in the initial days of the Ford Foundation's overseas programs, the principal beneficiary was the state. Indeed, in some countries, India being one of them, me too, we actually entered into agreements with governments that we would not make grants without the approval, in essence, of the government. Fortunately, that's not the experience of the Ford Foundation in many other parts of the world, but it has colored our work. Of course, in the intervening 50 years, many things have altered the equation between the state and non-state organizations, among them a growing disillusionment with the ability of states to deliver needed services in a rights-respecting manner, the collapse of the Soviet Union and a whole host of states liberated from total state dominance of activities, and indeed the effective labors of people in the international human rights movement, people at the grassroots levels in many parts of the world to demonstrate that NGOs can make a difference.
While Bill Carmichael was in Rio in the 1960s, a shift in the military government's policy forced a young man to ask the Ford Foundation for a way to do policy research outside the status quo. That man was Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who later became president of Brazil, a member of the UN Eminent Persons Group, and on this occasion, a keynote speaker at the Colloquium.
As president of Brazil, as has been said here for 8 years, I can testify to the immense value of respecting, listening, and linking up with the source of energy brought by civil society. Let me take a concrete example to make my point. Brazil has one of the best programs to fight AIDS.
The fight against HIV/AIDS was a sub-theme of the NGO Colloquium. Here, too, governments and civil society are testing their roles and relationships in a battle of a different kind, the enemies being disease, apathy, and stigma.
I'd like to get back to this question that you raised on AIDS. The story that you told about civil society and the campaign on AIDS and against the patent rules was very striking and very powerful. But the underlying problem was the original rules. The TRIPS.
What?
The underlying problem was the original international rules on patent rights, the TRIPS Accord, that made it difficult for Brazil to overcome the patent problems. So the fundamental problem is really how the global rules are made in the first place. And the civil society campaigns are a stopgap measure to try to redress the discrepancies in power and in how those rules are made in the first place. The rules are largely made by the G7 countries. And even large and powerful and rapidly growing countries such as Brazil do not have equal voices in those decision-making processes. The Canadian Prime Minister, Paul Martin, is now pushing very hard for the G7 to be replaced by the G20, which would include 10 major developing countries such as Brazil. And I wanted to get your reaction to that proposal. Do you think that Prime Minister Martin is correct that having the G7 play a major role in global decision-making would be a much better way to go? And if so, do you think it's politically realistic that the G7 would allow that to happen?
Of course, the G7 have the power and have money. But I think that's not possible to imagine that the G7 by their own will be able to solve problems. This is a much more ample question. You refer to G20. I don't know who are within the G20. So the point is that I think what is important is to establish networks, including different countries, different governments. The G7, is much more, I don't know to what extent you are aware of what really consists on the G7 meeting. It's just a meeting. They don't have any instrument, a permanent instrument to enforce decisions. It's a meeting. It's important because they may call attention for one problem, but how to implement? And the implementation cannot be in the hands of only a limited number of governments. It depends on local governance, certainly, each government, and basic depend on social mobilization.
My brief presentation today is going to be, or it's going to address two roles. One is the work that we are doing at WHO, World Health Organization, in scaling up ARV treatment for people living with HIV and AIDS in the developing world. And the other piece, which is what I'll start with, is putting a human face and talking of issues of stigma and how oftentimes religious institutions have perpetuated stigma and how they can probably do a better role of helping reduce that stigma. As you heard, I am a native of Kenya, and I was diagnosed HIV positive 17 years ago.
I think it's very important, as I mentioned yesterday as I was speaking, is bringing the reality into the room. Oftentimes we look at numbers, and these numbers are like miles and miles away from us. But when you begin hearing real stories about people's lives, that makes a difference. And the fact that, oftentimes people come to me and say, oh, you're so brave. My story is the norm. If you go to a place like Africa, many parts of the developing world, this is what happens to a lot of the people there.
I lost my husband to AIDS 2 years later, and 4 years after that, I lost my job. Now, if you know anything about the developing countries, once you lose your job and you're HIV positive, they test you before they give you another job. So if you're HIV positive, you can't get a job. So luckily enough, I was able to sort of put a small wooden kiosk together where I sold bread and sugar and basic things like that, and I was able to support my children that way. And then I became ill in 1997. I came down